Hello, everyone. This is the 137th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog, and I'm joined by Paul from Shipley in England of the 1888 Letter blog. For this episode, we interview English author and podcaster Mr. Rob Fletcher discussing his book, Chaos, Controversy, and That Kung Fu Kick. 94-95, the Premier League's most dramatic season. This book covers the 1994-95 English Premier League season month by month. Mr. Fletcher is the editor of the Boro Mag, a podcast and publication about Middlesbrough. He has written for many outlets such as the Football Pink, Kit Magazine, Futbolista, among others. His other book is 1992, The Birth of Modern Footbal. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks for having me, Sean. I'm really looking forward to chatting through this book. Plenty of details and controversy and incident to fill a book and a podcast, I think.
Indeed. So, can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Rob Fletcher. I'm originally from Middlesbrough, currently residing in Liverpool. And I've been a Middlesbrough supporter pretty much all my life. My introduction into football was through my uncle, and he shared some videos of Tottenham Hotspur from the back end of the 1980s to the early 90s. So it was Chris Waddle, Paul Gascoigne, Gary Lineker. I'm never quite winning anything, I suppose, is a good introduction, is what I would say. Been similar for Middlesbrough, actually, maybe not at the top end of the table, but certainly we've had a little bit of success. So from that, kind of started following football a little bit. Obviously started following Manchester United because they started winning things in the early 90s. This season, actually, although I didn't write about it a lot in this book, was probably my first sort of season in football as a football fan. So I started supporting Middlesbrough when Brian Robson left Manchester United and became player and manager at Boro. So this is kind of a bit of a jumping off point for me, really, when like that serious football fandom starts, if you like. Just come off the back of USA 94. I remember drawing all the football kits when I was like 8, 9 years old that summer, kind of really starting to get into it, collecting football stickers. But this is kind of the season where it all gets a little bit real for me. I managed to get a couple of references to Middlesbrough in this book, but not many. And as time's gone on, yeah, been a season ticket holder in Middlesbrough. I'd always written as well. I'd enjoyed writing over time at school, through university. Gradually started to get into writing about football, and through lockdown set up the Boro Mag, which was kind of, I realised that nobody was ever really going to do a high-end Middlesbrough football magazine from any sort of mainstream publication. So I thought, why not do it myself? So I set that up during COVID, and we released a few editions of those, raised a few £1,000 for charity in that time as well, which was great. And then eventually and gradually moved into writing for other magazines, and then find myself writing about 90s football in the form of these couple of books that I've done so far.
Thank you, Rob. You may have partially answered this one, but what prompted you to write a book about this particular season of the Premier League, apart from the more obvious event that your book cover and title references?
So when I'd written 1992, The Birth of Modern Football, I'd planned to do a more direct sequel to it and talk about 1996, a boom in modern football. The idea that sort of Euro 96, the transfers of Alan Shearer and Ronaldo kind of started to kickstart huge spending across Europe, really, and not just in Serie A. So it was more to look at that, to be honest. And I thought actually that would be quite a nice sort of companion for the first book and sort of how things had developed. And I was talking to Pitch Publishing about doing it. I pitched it to them, and I was talking to Paul, who leads on all things Pitch, and he was saying, well, why don't we try and sort of sneak in a few things from before that? Maybe Manchester United bring in through the class of 92. And then we sort of said, well, why don't we bring in everything that happens in 94, 95? It probably didn't really fit in as much as I wanted it to. So I'd sort of said, well, why don't we just do a direct book about 94, 95? Like, there's lots of incident in there. It was a really interesting season. There's probably a lot of content you can get out of it for a book. So I kind of shifted towards that, and we sort of agreed that that would be a good point to focus the whole book on, to be honest.
What was your process in researching for this book and the duration it took? And did you manage to interview any of the protagonists?
Do you know what? Actually, it's very difficult trying to get a hold of a lot of footballers to try and interview them for anything, really, to be honest. A lot of players, probably in the more modern era, are sort of behind publicists now. or the sort of part of the football club's kind of PR machine. You've got to go through them. But I did speak to Tony Gale, who was part of the Blackburn squad, who obviously won the title that season. That was a really good conversation, getting that little bit of dressing room insight. And I also spoke to Brian Horton as well, who obviously was Manchester City manager at the time. So he gave a little bit of an insight into what that was like for him, because it was a bit of a challenging season for them. They had new ownership, a new chairman. It was possible they were looking to move him on. So that was an interesting thing for him. But most of the research that I did was from around football books and magazines, TV programs, sort of highlights from around the time, trying to get into the mindset of what did players, newspapers think at the time. A lot of books get written retrospectively and sort of smooth out some of the details, or maybe move away from some of the rough edges that were there. Whereas I kind of, as most people do, wanted to go back to the actual time of the book. So that was really good. Process wise, I'm a bit of a writer who needs to kind of see the deadline fast approaching to actually kick me into gear. So I think at one point I was probably writing a couple of thousand words a day, really, and sort of hammering through it that way on top of the day job. So lots of late starts and early morning finishes. But I think for me, especially when I'm writing, when I get into the rhythm of it, it's just kind of that daily process. But a lot of the research is just kind of finding out what happened in the season for the months before it, really. So probably like 6 to 8 months, maybe researching, looking at magazines, books, watching endless Sky Sports highlights on YouTube, looking through all football magazines that Sean, you sort of shared with me as well from those years, and then trying to put it all together, really. So a lot of it is very impractical, I would say, as opposed to that writing perspective. It'd be nice if I could do kind of spread it out over a longer period of time, but it doesn't work like that for me, really. And I think that having that deadline in front of me, or basically try and work out what is the latest I can start writing and still hit a deadline. But then what happens then is I realized about halfway through I needed another 20,000 words roughly. I was supposed to write about 55, 60,000 words. I think it ended up at 82,000. But I didn't realize that until sort of part of the way through. So that was like frantically trying to talk to the publisher and say, right, I need another 20,000 words and it's probably going to be a couple of weeks late. But it was fine. And to be fair, Pitch Publishing are brilliant on that front. They're very sort of supportive and kind of will help you through that. And there's no kind of, they've obviously got their own deadlines. But yeah, so I finished that. Funnily enough, probably finished it around the end of February. So again, it's quite a long time between that and then when the book comes out. So all that 94, 95 knowledge that's like stored in your head slowly starts to seep out. So when I've started to come to do podcasts and things like that around the release, it's been quite good getting back into it again and finding out and rereading all those things.
Can you paint a picture for us of the status of the English Premier League by the summer of 1994?
Yeah, I think this was quite an interesting one to take on after doing the 92 book, which obviously part of that is the Premier League formation and kind of what that looks like. USA 94 was a massive event, I think, in football. And I think one of the things it sort of showed is that television audience maybe around the globe that hadn't been there before. Obviously, the start of the Champions League in 92 had changed that in terms of the contracts with television companies. Sky paid an incredible amount of money for the first set of Premier League games. And I think that changed the way that clubs spent money and spent money on wages. I think Alan Sugar's famous for saying that the owners are not going to see any of this new TV money. It's going to be agents and players and those big transfer fees. And that was pretty much where the league was at. It was nowhere near competing with Serie A at that point, who were spending, tens of millions of pounds on transfers every summer. And it probably didn't look that different to the product that had been there in the first division, to be honest. The football hadn't really changed. It was very similar. Obviously, England hadn't been at the World Cup. English football hadn't been exposed to European football, obviously, because of the ban the back end of the 80s. United had obviously won the Cup Winners' Cup at this point. So we're starting to get a bit of normality, shall we say, on the continent maybe, but I don't think the football had really sort of changed that much. Arsenal in this season obviously get to the final and lose to Zaragoza with that famous Naeem goal. But the Champions League, I suppose, was something that was very different for English clubs, and Manchester United's initial struggles showed that tactically maybe the league was a little bit behind where it had been previously in terms of that dominance from, 77 to 84 in terms of the European Cup. And I think English football was ready to change a little bit and probably that sign of Jurgen Klinsmann off the back of his sort of World Cup performances, bringing a star like that to the league. That was what kick-started probably the boom into the 90s, or the mid-90s and afterwards, I suppose, and changed how English football saw itself. And it became more of a continental game, more of a global game. I'm partially concerned with making sure that you've sold the TV rights for all this money. We need to actually make sure that people watch it now. And that's kind of what starts to shift in this season.
To present the state of things, we have the Manchester United of Sir Alex, who won the title twice in a row. And this is the era of the class of 92 and Ryan Giggs and Eric Cantona, Roy Keane. We have Blackburn Rovers, who built a team with Kenny Dalglish as manager and Jack Walker as their benefactor slash owner, who've bought the likes of Alan Shearer, and we'll get to Chris Sutton, among others. We have Liverpool, who'd been in decline for a number of seasons with Graham Souness, who are now under the managership of Roy Evans. We have the boring Arsenal of George Graham with the likes of Ian Wright, Tony Adams, among others. We have Everton, who've been having a couple of atrocious seasons, who've had appointed in the previous season Mike Walker, the former Norwich manager, but who hasn't really improved things. We have Tottenham with Ozzy Ardiles as the romantic manager, preaching attacking football. A couple of seasons ago, there was a dispute with Alan Sugar and Terry Venables, and that has dominated the headlines. And of course, we have Newcastle under Kevin Keegan as manager, and the strike force of Andy Cole and Peter Beardsley, who are, again, the romantics' favorite for, again, playing an attacking type of football. So that's kind of what the landscape is as far as the main teams and the talking points. But getting back to what you said about the 1994 World Cup, what was the immediate impact of this World Cup to the new Premier League season?
I think the biggest thing is the sort of transfer policies of teams in the Premier League. I think before this point, it was very much trading within the league. It was definitely not an outward-looking league in terms of bringing in players from overseas, partly because obviously restrictions on movement at that time, restrictions on foreign players in leagues, whether that's European competitions as well, and across the continent, made it very difficult for players from outside of the UK to actually come to the league and make an impact. There've been some, but none that really had kind of made a lasting impact of what was about to come in the 1990s, I would say, with people like Eric Cantona. But clubs started to look abroad for players. Obviously, that can increase their reach in terms of the audiences that they've sort of broadcasting their games to as a league, but also as a club themselves. And clubs started to invest money in signing some of these players. I'm not going to say just based on the back of the performances in World Cup USA 94, but I'm not sure how many people had scouted someone like Dan Petrescu of Romania before this summer. I don't think like now where you've got 5-6 scouts and they've got a list of every single player in Europe and all different leagues and how they fit into all different kinds of positions. But for a club like Sheffield Wednesday to invest some money in someone who'd starred really as part of Romania's side that probably surprised a few people in the tournament, signings like that were very unusual at that time. So I think for scouts, for teams that were watching the World Cup, it started to open their eyes to some of these other players who technically were probably better than a lot of players in the English league, but may be able to adapt and actually provide entertainment value, get bums on seats. And I think, as I said before about Klinsmann signing for Spurs, that was such a huge sign off the back of the tournament where, although maybe Germany were criticised a little bit, Klinsmann's a star and a star in Europe and had played in Serie A and been a star there. And obviously he was a well-known name. So I think from that point of view, it really started to shift the focus for the signings. And I actually think, and this is maybe a topic for another book, I'd love to do something around that sort of change in policy and transfers in the 1990s in England, because you start to see it with Klinsmann's arrival this summer, Ruud Gullit the following summer, then you've got Dennis Bergkamp as well, then sort of Juninho, Ravanelli, Gianfranco Zola, Di Matteo, Benito Cab, all those players eventually start to flow into the league, and the league totally shifts direction into who are the foreign stars that you've got in your team. to sell tickets, season tickets, get eyes on the league on TV, really. So I think this is probably the tournament that starts to shift that, and then clubs start to shift their own behaviour after seeing this as well.
Other players who stood out during the World Cup who made their way to England included the Romanians Ili Dumitrescu and George Popescu, who joined Klinsmann at Tottenham. We have the Swedish midfielder Stefan Schwarz joining Arsenal, although for only one season, it turned out. You have another Swedish player, Klas Ingesson. He joined Sheffield Wednesday. You have the Nigerian striker Daniel Amokachi joining Everton. You have Kevin Keegan signing Swiss defender Mark Hochiger and Belgian defender Philippe Albert. The American Kobe Jones joins Coventry City. You have the Dutch winger Brian Roy joining Nottingham Forest. So you have all these players coming in. And you even have the Brazilian striker, Luis Müller. He almost joined Everton, but I think the dispute was over the fact that he thought his salary was post-tax, but it actually, he didn't take into account the tax that was going to take out of his salary. So that was a transfer that fell through. You have all these World Cup players coming into the English league. And as you say, it increased the profile of the league.
But as you're saying, maybe an indication that things haven't changed that much. The biggest transfer of that close season was actually Blackburn signing Chris Hudson from Norwich. Do you think that was a little bit of a surprise, given that he was still uncapped at the time?
Yeah, 100%. And I think he was so young. I think he was 21 at the time when he made the move. And it wasn't like he was a Shearer that had a couple of seasons behind him where he proved he could score goals over a longer period of time. The parallels between the Shearer and Sutton transfers are quite interesting, actually, because when Shearer signed to Blackburn and they broke the record in 92, he was well thought of and highly rated. But again, you were buying a lot of potential more than anything, I think, for Shearer. He'd scored goals at Southampton, but he certainly wasn't prolific. And there's probably nobody really who could have predicted that he was going to get over 100 goals in 3 seasons for Blackburn in that early sort of part of his career there. Norwich played this pretty well. They set a £5 million fee for Sutton right from the start of the summer. Ferguson had looked at him for a long time. George Graham had looked at him for a long time. I think Ferguson played a bit of mind games with Dalglish and with George Graham, certainly about how much he was bidding and whether he was going to be going in and out again for him. And I think United got to about 4.5 million and Arsenal were not too far away. But to be fair to Norwich, they just stood firm. But Blackburn knew if they wanted the man, they'd have to pay the money. And quickly they did. And his partnership with Shearer was good. Shearer was really good friends with Mike Newell, who was his current strike partner in the previous seasons. They were really good friends off the pitch. Newell was a different kind of striker to Sutton. Sutton definitely wanted to be someone who was getting in the goals too, but it certainly meant that Blackburn had 2 really accomplished strikers they could rely on, rather than a main striker plus sort of that second striker, if you like. But for Sutton, it was a really good move for him because he had a foil and he could sort of play his own game. He knew he was going to get lots of balls into the box. Wilcox and Ripley were brilliant at that. And I think the partnership really blossomed from there. Interestingly, Shearer was quickly offered a new contract actually when Sutton signed, because obviously Sutton's wages were decent size for a signing like that. And very quickly, Shearer was offered a contract to make sure that he remained as the highest paid player at the club, which probably sort of give an indication of how the 2 strikers were seen by the club. Shearer is definitely our main striker, our number 9. But Sutton is here basically to be the man who's going to sort of power us towards a title from there. And I think Blackburn sort of really benefited from that because their goals tally increased. And I think Sutton was certainly someone in the early part of the season who was really able to get Blackburn sort of to give them that X factor, if you want to call it that, where he could actually push them forward. They scored 17 more goals from 93-94 to 94-95. So that 5 million looks like a bit of a bargain, really.
Alan Sugar, I think he stated that they were never going to pay that kind of a money for someone who was just potential at that point. But I guess it worked out for Blackburn Rovers in the end. Naturally, we have to discuss Jurgen Klinsmann's transfer to Tottenham and the whole diving school press conference. In some circles, he was seen as a player past his best. He was playing in a French league in Monaco, but he did have a good World Cup. So what was the initial view on him?
I think the initial view was that they were signing a star. I think really a lot of the press that came out around that was sort of, again, it's that changing face of the league and the types of players that you're able to attract being part of the Premier League, more than the fact that he was a German who'd been ridiculed for diving. I think the fact that he came over and really not attacked that with the media, but he was kind of upfront about, yeah, you think this is me, that's absolutely fine. I'll show you what I'm like. And I think very quickly, especially with this goal on his debut, the fact that he dived for that celebration will be one of the most iconic moments in Premier League history forever, because it changes the league, because it's showing that someone who's from another country could succeed here. And he's mocking the press effectively. And I think we probably all know from looking back at football, the press held quite a strong opinion on football and football fans and the money that was coming into football. They were still kind of powering a lot of that discussion more than anything else. And Klinsmann's a kind of, I don't think he mocked himself, but he certainly had that kind of knowing look that, okay, let's have a little bit of fun with this. And I think it was Teddy Sheringham who said, why don't we, when you score, why don't we do the dive? And obviously the first game at Hillsborough against Sheffield Wednesday, he did that. And lots of people will remember from their time watching Match of the Day that he did that. He kind of became a player that you almost instantly liked. And that wasn't probably quite common for, firstly, other people's players, and secondly, for a German who in World Cup 1990 had held a bit of a hold over us and would do that again in 1996. So from that point of view, it certainly opened up the league to have some more interesting characters in it, maybe. And I think someone like Klinsmann really played into that. It was interesting that a lot of the press that I'd read around it in sort of magazines and newspapers, there was a little bit of a sort of mocking tone with how much he was being paid, whether he was on a certain goal bonus or not. And I think that played into it a little bit, but quickly he became a hero for Spurs fans, and most of the press realised that it was a pretty good thing for the league, and he was a good footballer as well.
As we've discussed, Blackburn picked up where they'd left off the previous season effectively with the new strike force of Shearer and Sutton, the SAS. Although, as you mentioned, Sutton's goals dried up slightly in the second half of this season. What was the takeaway of the team in general? What were the other players that contributed at the time?
I've talked about this a few times, and I think it's worth making the point all the time when you talk about Blackburn, and a lot of people say they bought the league or they bought the league title. And my argument is always, everybody's bought the league title. It's just how you've spent your money, really, and how you've invested it. I think Liverpool in the 80s were probably a little bit of an aberration in the sense that they were never the biggest spenders in the league. They always kind of invested really shrewdly. They had that long-term view of replacing players maybe a season or two before they were sort of past the best. But for a team like Blackburn, if they wanted to do well in the Premier League, they had to spend money. That was just the fact, really. And I actually think that the age of the players that they bought was sensible. So when they bought people like Stuart Ripley, Jason Wilcox, Tim Sherwood, who all had an impact in midfield and attack for them, it was sensibly spent money. You know, they weren't buying players who were 29, 30, who had done it somewhere else. They were trying to get players who were on the up. I think that really worked for them as well. Getting someone like Tim Flowers in, I think it was early-ish in the 93-94 season when he arrived. Again, one of the best goalkeepers, but on the right side of his age bracket. So when you're buying players like that, you are going to feel a benefit for a couple of seasons. Graham Lasso, another one they brought in to replace someone like Alan Wright. They were upgrading as they went through, and it was really sensible what they were doing. Yes, they were spending more money, but then most teams were spending a lot of money as the years would go on, as the Premier League money would come in. They were sort of just the first ones to do it. I'm not going to say they were the 90s equivalent of like Abramovich's Chelsea, but they certainly kind of upset a few people with how much they were spending. But for Dalglish, he was proving on the pitch that it was successful. So I think from that point of view, it was certainly well invested. But those players who I mentioned, who were all kind of the nucleus of the side, all had a big impact that season. And I think probably players like Ripley and Wilcox were underrated because, and Lasso to a certain extent, the delivery they could get through to Shearer and Sutton had to be very good, and it was, and it meant that Shearer and Sutton could play their own game and get the goals that would get them towards the top end of the league.
And they'd given Manchester United a good run for their money in the previous season and really pushed them towards the end. And this season, like we mentioned, they just picked up where they were last season, and they would be leading the lead for much of the season as Manchester United would struggle somewhat. In the early months of the season, once we come to November, you have a number of sackings of managers. You have Ron Atkinson being fired at Aston Villa, Mike Walker, who never really was able to get anything done at Everton. He was predictably sacked. Not to mention Ozzy Ardless at Tottenham, whose policy of having 5 forwards just was not feasible in the Premier League. And he would be replaced by Jerry Francis, who actually resigned at the Queen's Park Rangers just days prior. You have Brian Little, who was the manager of Leicester City, going back to his old love, Aston Villa, and Joe Royal picking up at Everton, coming from Oldham. And like we mentioned, Jerry Francis replacing Ardless, and Ray Wilkins, who was a player manager at Crystal Palace, I believe. He joined Queen's Park Rangers as manager. What was the takeaway of these changes in this month?
I think the chaos in the title kind of sums up the managerial changes in November, to be honest. I remember when you first started researching something like this, obviously I've got my own memories of the season. I remember Cantona's kick. I remember there's things about George Graham. I remember sort of the last game of the season, Chris Sutton signing. I never remembered that there was this many managerial changes at the time. So obviously I went through, some internet sources and even like started with Wikipedia, what's the table look like? What were the changes through the season? And there's a box that's just got all the managerial changes with like the caretaker managers, the dates, when it all happened. And literally it's absolute carnage. And I think from very early on, I think it's pretty much the 1st of November when Ardiles goes. Then you've got caretakers coming in, then obviously Walker and Atkinson get sacked as well. But I think one of the things that I found quite interesting looking at all the newspapers around the time is obviously the constant rumour mill of who's going to take over. So that was really interesting to see, well, who's being lined up for these posts. You mentioned Ray Wilkins. He just left QPR for Crystal Palace. His debut for Crystal Palace was at Selhurst Park, where they lost 6-1 to Liverpool. And he got injured and never played for Palace again because he left them to go back to QPR to be player manager. So even in that 2 or 3 month spell for Wilkins, he'd gone from I've left Palace, left QPR, become a Palace player, and he's gone back to be player manager and did brilliantly actually, and took over from Jerry Francis and kept that team going. So even little things like that. Then there's Mike Walker, who spent all kinds of money at Everton, having done well with Norwich. We all remember the UEFA Cup run, beaten by Munich. Everton thought, right, this is the man, we'll play good football. That went completely wrong because they just didn't buy into what he was doing. Joe Royal comes back. You get the Dogs of War at Everton. That kind of gritty, determined team that you might associate with Everton. So there's so much going on there. And Brian Little, I think for me, it was looking back at all the links with some of these players, like George Burley at Ipswich, which is a little bit later on in the season, but like Brian Little going back to Aston Villa. There's all these little links that you could find and you could pick up, which is really interesting. But I do remember writing that chapter, particularly, it was very much, this person's got sacked, this person's been linked. Oh, someone else has been sacked, someone else has lost, someone else has been sacked. And it's just kind of that domino all the time. And the sackings and the managerial changes go right up to April when John Dean resigns from Norwich. It's one of those things where I think last season, if I remember rightly, nobody was anyone sacked in the Premier League, or there was very few sackings, and it was one of those seasons that was a bit of an aberration, wasn't it? But this certainly was not that, and they just kept coming thick and fast, really.
And in fact, Jerry Francis, he resigned on November 11th, and I think he was appointed as Tottenham manager on November 15th. That's how quick there was a turnaround. And you mentioned, predictably, in December, John Lyall, he quit as Ipswich manager, who would be relegated by the end of the season.
Yeah, and I think some of those later ones, I think, were probably a little bit inevitable more than anything else. Teams at the wrong end of the table, they throw one last roll of the dice. Can we get a manager to change it? For Ipswich, it worked out brilliantly, actually, with George Burley, because I think he was there until maybe 2002, 2003-ish, I think, when obviously he got them into Europe after they'd been promoted from the first division. So again, that worked as a long-term thing. Didn't keep them in the league, but you could see that long-term that worked really well for them. And I think Brian Little also won the Coca-Cola Cup, if I remember rightly, maybe with Aston Villa in 95 and 96. Yeah. So again, these things worked out in the long run for some of these clubs, and Spurs, I think Francis was quite well liked, to be honest, but just couldn't get them to that next level, really.
And a team we've not mentioned yet, but you've got the return of Nottingham Forest to the Premier League this season. And another of those links that you mentioned, it was under Frank Clark, one of Brian Clough's team in the 1970s. You also had the emergence of Stan Collymore there. But I imagine that nobody expected UEFA Cup qualification.
Absolutely not. And I think Newcastle the season before had finished really strongly. And Andy Cole obviously broke the record for the most goals scored in a Premier League season at that point with 34. They'd sort of proved that you could do it. You could make that jump. And we probably all know back then the gap wasn't as big between the second tier and the first tier. If you had a really good striker or a really solid defence or whoever it might have been, you probably could do quite well. Leeds had done it previously. Sheffield Wednesday had done it previously. There wasn't this huge chasm like my club, Middlesbrough. If we were to be promoted at the end of this season, we'd probably spend £100 million to finish maybe 18th or 17th. Whereas actually then, if with some wise investment, 4, 5, £6 million, you probably could get top 6, top 8. Forest spent wisely. Brian Roy was an excellent signing. Another one of those players who just didn't quite adapt to Serie A. He'd obviously thrived at Ajax under certain managers, but Louis van Gaal didn't really fancy him at that point. Obviously went to Foggia. Didn't go maybe to plan there, but Forest brought him along. Stan Collymore was one of those talents, though, that wasn't like a lot of other strikers in the league. He had the size, the physicality, the speed, but also the intelligence to play that striking role. And he linked up really well with Brian Roy and they complemented each other really well. And Forest played some really good football that season. They were really good to watch. And to their credit, all season they were in the top 5, pretty much right from day one. So they thoroughly deserved where they were in the league. And they had a couple of tricky runs, which, I mean, we all know watching football, every team has 5 or 6 games where you think, oh, actually, that's the drop-off. They're not going to finish any higher. But they came back and they had a really strong finish to the season. And they really deserved that place in Europe. They didn't lose after the end of February, really. So again, it just shows you they had that consistency throughout the season. And really, Collymore was brilliant to watch. He was so good to watch. He scores a goal against Manchester United on the first Monday Night Football that just perfectly epitomises everything that was good about him. And Ferguson was desperate to get him. Desperate to get him. But basically, and it sounds funny saying it now, they just never returned his phone calls. He'd ring up Nottingham Forest training ground and say, oh yeah, Mr. Clark's busy at the moment, Mr. Ferguson, he can't speak to you about Stan Collymore. And that was that. There was no kind of like, well, let's find his agent, let's email him, let's go find him, this kind of stuff. It was very much he's not available. Basically, I think he was hiding in his office for most of the time. And they ended up not going to United, but then obviously Liverpool come in with a massive bid and actually beat Everton to his signature. Everton thought they had a pretty good chance of getting him, but he ended up on the other side of Merseyside.
Collymore, along with Steve Stone and Colin Cooper, would soon be capped by England. Let's get to the action in Europe. You have Blackburn eliminated in the first round of the UEFA Cup, and Manchester United somewhat unimpressive in the Champions League. There's that famous 0-4 loss in Barcelona of Stoichkov and Romario with Gary Walsh in goal because of foreign player restrictions. You somewhat touched upon it, but were English clubs still adjusting the return to Europe following the Heysel ban?
I think so, yeah. And I think Rangers had proved, I think in the Champions League in 92, 93, that they'd spent a lot of money on their squad and they'd sort of made sure they had players who were capable of competing at that level. I don't think English clubs had done the same from a financial point of view. They hadn't invested the money on the playing side and they hadn't really sort of adapted to that new style, more so in the sort of Champions League, European Cup. In those sort of two-legged knockout competitions, I do think that there was obviously some success with Manchester United in the Cup Winners' Cup. Arsenal and Chelsea had some successes as well in terms of getting through to the later rounds. And maybe that's a little bit more similar to what they would be used to in English football with the Coca-Cola or the League Cup, for example, as it was with these two-legged games. But for Manchester United in a league format, it looked like they had quite a generous group. I mean, they had Gothenburg and they had Galatasaray, but the draw in Turkey and then the defeat in Gothenburg really for Ferguson was a pretty tough pill to swallow. So he realised that if he was going to compete long-term, they needed to make some changes. And obviously at the end of the season, you see Hughes, Kanchelskis and Paul Ince all leave and the sort of development of the younger players who he can adapt into that sort of style start to come through. So, yeah, I mean, we can't say it was so far behind the fact that Arsenal got into a final this season, but it certainly wasn't anywhere near what some of the other teams were doing at this point in Europe.
And we did get to see David Beckham score his first goal for Manchester United against Galatasaray, in which was essentially a dead rubber match.
Yeah, and I think Ferguson was quite good at giving his younger players minutes in some of those games. Maybe, obviously, that comes back to harm them when they go to the new camp and they're kind of embarrassed more than anything else. But again, that's partly due to the restrictions on some of the players they're allowed to select. Obviously, famous scenes of Schmeichel and Cantona watching on from the new camp crowd made it more difficult for United. But again, UEFA, who seem to change the rules every year, probably for the 4 or 5 years prior to that, quickly changed that and they can start to at least compete at that level.
Moving to what maybe well, certainly the most infamous image, shall we say, of the season, which has been covered and analysed ad nauseum. But can you just walk us through the Cantona Kung Fu kick and its aftermath in January 1995?
Yeah, I think Cantona was known, obviously, before he come to England as a bit of a controversial character in France. I mean, we've probably all seen the compilations on YouTube of Cantona's various indiscretions on a football pitch, with lots of suspensions, falling out with various managers, calling them out in public, bouncing around between leagues. But I think when he came to United, I think things were a little bit different. Ferguson was looking for a talisman to play in the side. Obviously, he powered that sort of 92-93 team to get to the first title. He was amazing in 93-94, but he still had that time when the red mist could come down, stamping on John Moncur at Swindon, for example, the season before. I don't think people could have predicted he would have done something like this. But I think they probably could have predicted him getting sent off in a game like this, where central defenders were going to niggle him, stand on his toes, kick him, foul him, pull his shirt, all that sort of stuff. You could imagine he would react in that way. And I think from when you watch it back, most of the players are more annoyed that he's been sent off because he'd been told in the dressing room, relax, Eric, go out there, make sure that you don't do anything silly. And within a minute of the restart, he's gone. So all the players obviously are arguing with most of the Palace players is, you're the ones who've got him sent off. So there's kind of the melee on the pitch that's happening. And then the kit man, who's a little bit older, a bit more experienced, a bit of a wise head, shall we say, is trying to sort of shepherd him down the touchline. Because obviously at Selhurst Park, the tunnel is like right in the corner. So he's got to do that sort of walk of shame, if you like, in front of all of those Crystal Palace fans. And needless to say, he is called a few names and heckled by the Palace fans, as you can see by the picture and the still. And then one of them comes up and insults him with words I won't repeat on the podcast, but I'm sure people could find out what some of those were. And then he loses it and he just dives into the crowd. And there's that behind me, the iconic image of Cantona launching himself into the crowd. And I remember watching it back as a kid. I had that kit as well. I had the black Manchester United kit as well. And it's just that iconic image. It's kind of one of those things that's like etched into your football memory. We've probably all got them from like when we were younger. And for me, that is one of the sort of defining moments from my time as a football fan, really, for better or worse. Because obviously what comes out is there's a court case afterwards. He's banned by United. He's fined, I think, a month's wages, if I remember rightly. I think it was 4 weeks. He's then banned by the FA, which extended the Manchester United ban. Everybody in the newspapers are salivating at the fact that they've now got reams and reams of pages they can fill with this Cantona scandal. They want him banned. It's the classic thing where the newspapers must have a meeting and think, right, this has happened. Right, let's get an MP to be really annoyed. Let's get like some people off the street. Let's get some ex-footballers. Let's get a current manager. And they just could fill the newspapers with all this stuff. And it just went on and on. And then obviously things come to light about the person Matthew Simmons, who been the one who'd kind of been insulting Cantona as he's gone down. He then goes to court and it just becomes this saga over and over again. And then we get the famous seagulls following the trawler quote, which again, as a kid, I mean, I was 9 at the time. I was like, what is he talking about? I mean, some people probably still think it now, but obviously he was basically talking about the media and how they were basically just following him around and waiting for this to happen. And there it was. They had their moment and they could fill their column inches with it. I do always find that the irony of this all is that obviously his jail sentence was turned into community service, which then turned into him going to help young children, Manchester United fans, at the cliff and give them football training. Now imagine as a primary school child, as a kid, How did the training session go today? Oh, do you remember that Eric Cantona who kicked that fan in the crowd? Yeah, he was coaching us today. Like, what a memory that must be for that group of whatever they were, 7 to 11-year-olds. They've now got that memory forever. I just found that quite ironic that his community service wasn't kind of picking up litter, shamed on the streets, but it was at his home training ground every day, coaching these young footballers. But yeah, certainly a bit of a saga in the press, and obviously the tragedy that happens with Paul Nixon, the fan who unfortunately was killed in another game between Manchester United and Palace, which kind of really sours the whole thing. And all of that is happening amongst this title challenge, the defamation of Cantona's character, that it kind of becomes the central point of an increasingly controversial season.
With Cantona out of the picture for the rest of the season, Manchester United desperately need another striker. We come to Newcastle United, who've been flying high under Kevin Keegan since the previous season, with Andy Cole just banging in the goals along with Peter Beardsley. You have Robert Lee, now an England international. They're a very good team challenging for Europe. However, in January, we get the record sale of Andy Cole to Manchester United with the Northern Irish international Gillespie as part of the deal.
I think to sum up the Andy Cole transfer, kind of links into all the other incidents that are going on in the season. So Andy Cole's debut for Manchester United is the 22nd of January, which is at home to Blackburn, who are their biggest rivals. And then 3 days later, is the Crystal Palace Cantona incident, which actually Andy Cole had been bought to be Cantona's partner because Mark Hughes' contract was sort of a bit of a sticking point for United all the way through the season. He'd been linked with Everton. So within that 3-day period, they bought Andy Cole for a record fee. Kevin Keegan had appeared on the steps at St James's Park, trying to justify why he'd let him go. He'd made his debut and he kind of looked a little bit out of place and missed a couple of chances, but they beat Blackburn. Then his strike partner goes into the crowd and kicks a football fan. So within him signing in the 3 days of those matches, it probably sums up what 94-95 was about. But from a Newcastle point of view, Beardsley and Cole had been brilliant the year before. I think they got Beardsley for 1.4 or 1.7 million, I think, 93-94. They'd been a brilliant partnership, scored an absolute load of goals. And Cole was kind of one of those players who Ferguson thought, with a bit of refinement, he could be the player who can make the difference in Europe. That intelligent movement he had around the box, that speed of thought, his finishing ability was someone who could help United. Keegan probably knew that he couldn't win the league with Andy Cole. And I think that the relationship had soured a little bit as well between the manager and the player. So I think he probably knew that it might have been time to cash in and just try and get a different face within there. They'd already signed Paul Kitson, who definitely wasn't the answer. He wasn't really a replacement for Andy Cole. He was more to kind of bolster the forward line. But obviously, next summer they buy Les Ferdinand and Alan Shearer. So it was probably, in hindsight, possibly the right move for Newcastle. It won't have felt like that for Newcastle fans at the time. Obviously, that's why Keegan came out and said it. For United fans, it felt like they'd got a really, really good player. I do wonder, though, if they'd have managed to sign Stan Collymore, what that would have looked like for United, with a Collymore and Cantona front line. There's always these what ifs in football, isn't there? What if, this player went to this club, or what if Cantona didn't jump into the crowd, all those sorts of things. So I do wonder if that had been a different dynamic, but I think by the time the treble season comes around, I think Andy Cole had more than sort of paid his way from that transfer more than anything. But Keegan really liked Keith Gillespie. He really liked him, and he felt like it was a really good signing for them. Again, probably didn't reach the heights of an Andy Cole, but certainly he was worth $1 million within the deal. It was probably not a bad player to get.
Andy Cole, of course, would score 5 goals in another memorable Premier League event when Manchester United defeated Ipswich 9-0 later in a few months' time.
Yeah, that's a game I'll always remember. I was staying at my my grandma and granddad's house. At that time, I wasn't allowed to stay up and watch Match of the Day. But obviously, they used to put all the sort of results on the TV before, whatever Saturday night TV was starting on BBC One. And I remember my granddad being absolutely amazed that any club had scored 9 goals in this modern era. I think Did Liverpool beat Nottingham Forest like 7-1? I think they'd been, or
Crystal
7-0.
Palace.
Crystal Palace years earlier, and
Yeah,
that was kind
yeah.
of held up as one of the best performances. And I'd heard about that. But then this 9-0 felt very odd for the modern era that a team was that much better in that one game. And obviously Andy Cole scoring 5 and that helped bolster his goals tally for the end of the season. But yeah, I mean, you kind of feel bad that Ipswich had that hanging over them that season and for a long time after as a record defeat.
This season also sees something of a rebirth of Liverpool under Roy Evans, with Robbie Fowler leading the line, John Barnes back in shape. Would you have said that the future looked bright? They also picked up the League Cup.
I think not having Graham Souness in the dugout was probably the biggest thing for Liverpool, to be honest. Obviously, he left in 94. I think it was January, February 94, I think. And basically, they just stopped wasting money. And I think that was one of the probable things that Souness had done so quickly. He just tried to dismantle everything. And I think that really sort of ripped apart. I mean, we have to probably be honest about Liverpool this when Souness took over. They probably did need a little bit of renewal. And I think he was probably right to try and start that process. Julian Dix, Neil Ruddock, Nigel Clough in the summer before this season is probably not the kind of caliber of player that you want to be looking at when you consider, United had signed Schmeichel, Dennis Irwin, Andrei Kanchelskis as their sort of renewal, Cantona to sort of renew and rejuvenate their team to try and get over that 91-92 title loss. So for me, I think having Roy Evans there kind of brought that boot room culture back to the fore, really. And the fact that, in Souness's credit, Fowler and McManaman were coming through and he tried to give younger players like Jamie Redknapp as well a chance. You can't deny that he tried to do that and change the way the team was. But I think Evans tried to simplify it a little bit. He gave McManaman a free role. You had Fowler and Rush up front, like you say about John Barnes had come back into form. They had Jamie Redknapp who was starting to come through. They spent an awful lot of money on Phil Babb and John Scales, which at the time probably didn't look like that bad an investment. Phil Babb had looked pretty good next to Paul McGrine, World Cup 94. But then the three of us would probably look pretty good if you've got Paul McGrath standing next to you when you're trying to defend. So maybe Phil Babb wasn't the right one, but Scales certainly looked like a really good prospect. Injuries obviously hampered him. Rob Jones was a really good player. You do wonder again, this what if scenario, if maybe Scales and Rob Jones had stayed fit and they decided not to get David James as a goalkeeper and maybe just get someone who's a bit more solid, what would the next step have been for Liverpool? Obviously, they won the League Cup. They got into the FA Cup final in 96. Would there have been something different for them on the horizon? You don't know, but certainly an enjoyable time for Liverpool at Anfield in this season, I would say.
Early in the season, Robbie Fowler scored the quickest hat trick in Premier League history against Arsenal.
Yeah, that again is another classic moment in sort of Premier League history, isn't it? Liverpool were kind of it felt like they were on the way up.
This would be a disappointing season for Arsenal on and off the field. You have the George Graham firing due to the Bung scandal. You also had the Paul Merson gambling addiction admission and the loss in the Cup Winners' Cup final with that famous Naeem goal from long way out. What was the takeaway from their negative season?
The hope that it never happens again was probably the main takeaway from quite a lot of people involved with Arsenal Football Club in this season, because on the pitch, I'd probably say nothing went right. It's not a season that Arsenal fans are going to remember fondly from a league point of view. Obviously, every club wants to win trophies, they want to get to finals, because at the end of the day, that's what you remember, isn't it? If you ask Arsenal about the 94-95 season on the pitch, they'll talk about Naeem's goal. You'll always remember the finals. You'll always remember the things that you missed out on. But from a league point of view, not great. Off the pitch, it's probably hard to know where to start for Arsenal. George Graham had built that club sort of in his image, really, and won league titles and have been successful. Obviously, some really famous games and famous moments for the club. His sort of dealings behind the scenes came under scrutiny and had done by the board earlier on in the season, and then obviously came into the press. And basically, he couldn't continue. And around February, Valentine's Day 95, he leaves under a cloud, himself gets a ban. And he'd also had to deal with the Paul Merson sort of revelations that had happened, that had come out in the papers about his drug and gambling addictions, which is actually, when you look back at it, it's just a really sad story. Paul Merson's had a lot of demons that he's had to sort of cope with over his career. And, he's still here and he's come through it and he's still trying to manage it. But this was kind of the first time when it was really coming out in the press of a big name player. And I think a lot of what I read was very much, why does he need to do this if he's got all this money? He's a footballer, he's on £3,000, £4,000 a week, £5,000 a week. Why does he need to gamble and drink and take drugs to release? And I think it started to make people realise maybe that these footballers were kind of a little bit like us, but raised their celebrity status a little bit by taking up those column inches again in the newspapers. So those things for Arsenal. What I found interesting actually about this for Arsenal is they continue to let George Graham spend money. So John Harton and Chris Kiwomya, who, again, talking about Clough, Ruddock and Dix going to Liverpool, probably sums it up a little bit for Arsenal. I mean, Harton had done well, probably not the right quality for Arsenal. Chris Kiwomya, again, another decent enough player, but certainly not the kind of player that's going to shift the needle for Arsenal to challenge Blackburn and Manchester United. So I was surprised they let him spend so much money.
Also, the Dutchman Glenn Helder, just before he was sacked. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I don't know what the board were thinking, really. Maybe they thought it was just going to go away, but it certainly didn't. Graham loses his job and they end up left with players who probably not the right quality for Arsenal Football Club.
Stuart Houston, his assistant, would become manager for the rest of the season. Incidentally, he would again replace George Graham as Tottenham manager towards the end of the decade, I believe. So that's a rare event. I imagine someone managing Arsenal and Tottenham, but as an assistant of the main manager and later becoming the full-time manager. Also, John Jensen, the Danish midfielder, he scored for the first time ever with Arsenal during this season. So that was also an event that was discussed. All in all, a very bad season for Arsenal. We also have to mention in February, Phil Neal is sacked as Coventry manager and Ron Atkinson gets back into management and becomes a manager of Coventry. Another event that maybe kind of went under the radar in the new year, the Ghanaian striker, Tony Yeboah, he joins Leeds from Frankfurt. And of course, he would make a big impact for Leeds the following season. We come to another off-the-field incident. There's a bribery scandal involving former Liverpool goalkeeper Bruce Grubler, who at this time was, I believe, at Southampton, as well as Wimbledon goalkeeper, the Dutchman Hans Segers, and striker John Fashanu. What can you say about this scandal?
Again, it kept the football on the front pages because now there's another revelation of maybe there's some match fixing being going on. It was someone who Bruce Grobbelaar had been an acquaintance with previously in another business venture in Zimbabwe, who'd come forward and said that he'd actually been asked or he'd had to be involved with these players taking bungs and fixing matches in the Premier League, which obviously for the league that was trying to present itself as family friendly and bringing in a different audience than football had in England in the 1980s, it didn't look good. It really didn't look good. But for them, it really was a long period of time. I think the court case wasn't until 1997. So it was kind of a bit of a cloud hanging over all of the players. One thing that again surprised me is they didn't get suspended. So they carried on playing. Like I hadn't remembered that or realised that whatsoever. Because I was trying to think to myself, well, in modern football, what would happen? They'd probably be kind of taken out of the team for 6 months, maybe 9 months or longer. If this was sort of hanging over them, would you continue to let them play? But they did continue to let them play. And Grobbelaar was the main sort of instigator who'd been accused, really, more than anything else. And they did all get found guilty in the end. And then Grobbelaar sues the son for things he'd printed, and then he ends up getting counters, and it becomes a bit of a mess, really, for all the players. But it's certainly something that, again, for a league that was trying to present itself out there as a league for all, a league for families to be able to come and watch and enjoy, it really didn't help. But Grobbelaar, he just left Liverpool, ended up being at Southampton, as you say, put in some good performances, but he's certainly, on the way out of his career, and maybe this was a catalyst to move that forward. But just another item in what was dubbed the season of sleaze by all the press. It didn't really enhance the Premier League's reputation, shall we say.
For the end of this season, we have more drama. Can you just walk us through the events of the final day of the season?
I feel like this final day was kind of that for the first Sky Sports final day, if you know what I mean. So obviously Sky Sports have been, showing football on a Sunday, football on a Monday, and they were starting to evolve their sort of coverage. It was getting a lot of press in terms of Martin Tyler and Andy Gray, Richard Keys. They were kind of the main presenting team. Richard Keys had toned down his extravagant jackets as time had went on to try and focus more a little bit on the football. But by this point, Manchester United were travelling to West Ham and Liverpool were away at Blackburn. And they always say, you couldn't write this sort of stuff. The scriptwriters couldn't write it. But Kenny Dalglish returning to Anfield, who are Manchester United's biggest rivals, really. They didn't want United to win the title. There was rumours that Blackburn shirts had been sold on Merseyside during sort of the week leading up to the game. There was talk of Blackburn fans in the Liverpool end. Liverpool fans with Blackburn scarves. So it was clear who they wanted to win. United were away at West Ham. And this was just a game of endless chances. Basically, West Ham got the lead and they could just sit back. So United were just a wave after wave of attack. Those black shirts just in the box all the time. Ludek McCloskey obviously has the game of his life and just repels everything from Manchester United. And basically for Blackburn go ahead early, which is brilliant for them. Great news for them. The drama comes right at the end. United have chances in the last 10 minutes to basically win the game. Blackburn are at 1-1. And then Liverpool get a free kick in the very last minute and Jamie Redknapp scores. So there's total confusion everywhere. So the fact that no one knew what was going on. Sky is showing these games concurrently so that they're going between them, happen at the same time. So at this point, when Redknapp scores, Blackburn go down to 89 points. They would have been on 90 if it was a draw. They're on 89 points. United are on 88. So if United get a winner, they win the league. Blackburn draw and United win, they'll win it on goal difference. So it's so tight. No one knows what's happening until a fan almost leaps it over into the dugout and starts telling Dalglish that you've won. The final whistle has gone, and Dalglish just bursts out in a beaming smile, and he just can't believe it. And obviously the stadium erupts. Blackburn have won the title. United have finished second, and they're pretty inconsolable down at Upton Park. But Blackburn, for them, coming from the old First Division into the Premier League, Jack Walker's dream has come true. His money has allowed them to win the Premier League, and what a moment for Dalglish to do it. After difficult circumstances when he leaves Liverpool, obviously with the stresses and strains of Hillsborough and everything that happened along with that. But an amazing moment for him. Shearer and Sutton with the trophy, two of the most expensive players in English football. It kind of feels like a brilliant moment to end the season, and for me, kind of encapsulates all the chaos that went on all the way through.
Moving on to the FA Cup final, which was a replay of one from 10 years earlier, but with the opposite result this time. And Joe Royle, after leaving Oldham, from which Oldham have never recovered, I might add, he certainly changed Everton's fortunes in a matter of months. How surprising was this outcome given their dismal start to the season?
Oh, I think everybody thought this was going to be a one-sided final. I think it was United's. Everybody thought it was United's to lose. Obviously, they beat Chelsea 4-0 the year before in a very one-sided second half in that final particularly. I remember coming home from this. Again, it's another memory of my own from the season. I've been at a school football tournament in the morning, got home at like 11:30. You watch like 3 hours of build-up for the FA Cup. And it was almost like Everton were there because Manchester United had to play someone else. They'd surprised everybody in the semi-final by beating 4-1 with the infamous Daniel Amokachi coming on, even though Joe Royle didn't want him to be on the pitch when there'd been an injury and he scores and they sort of get through to the final. Not many people expected it. Joe Royle had done a really good job with Everton. He'd made them hard to beat. He kind of made them a little bit more likeable as well, I think, in terms of the fans. They had that grit, that determination, that sort of never say die attitude. But most people thought it was going to be a Manchester United walkover. And I, for one, I remember really vividly Paul Rideout scoring and not really knowing what was going to happen next. Obviously, it was a very one-sided final from Manchester United's point of view. But seeing some of the players that were starting to come through in that team, you could see that there was a future for some of these players. This wasn't the end of the sort of United dynasty, as in they won a couple of titles and this was it. I'm not going to say it immediately felt like that for Blackburn, this was like a one-off, but this certainly for Manchester United felt like a one-off more than anything else, that this was just a blip in the road this season and they were sort of going to try and come back and see what would come next. But for Everton, what a moment. You've had Mike Walker, who looks like he's going to keep you in the relegation zone for most of the season, or at least struggling. And then all of a sudden, Joe Royle comes back in, fan favourite from his time as a player. And he comes out there and wins a trophy for them at the end of the season, which is just a magical moment for any team, especially when at Wembley.
Manchester United ended the season in disappointment with a loss on the final day, as well as this FA Cup final, not to mention the whole Eric Cantona affair. But the season saw the debut of Paul Scholes, a cameo by David Beckham, and Gary Neville established in defense. Like you mentioned just a few seconds earlier, was it self-evident that this crop of players were going places?
I think people probably knew that these players were going to have good professional careers. They probably thought that they'd have decent careers at Manchester United as well. Obviously, United have always had a tradition of bringing through young players, which they continue to promote now. Now the trophies have dried up a little bit. The fact that there was a group of players coming through at the same time, I'm not certain that had ever really happened where they were all from the same age group. Clubs have done it in the past where they've had, young players who've come through maybe a year or two after another one, and that forms your nucleus. But as a group coming together at the same time was quite unique. They could see there was a lot of talent available to them. Ferguson knew it as well. Ferguson knew it. Some of the players had played a little bit the year before just to kind of give him a taste of that first team action. But this is the season where he starts to realise, actually, I can probably play more of these players in these roles. And that's why you get the transfer business of the summer when you lose Ince, and Kanchelskis. He's quite happy to let them go. And he gives himself space and time to blood in that new set of players. But if you look at sort of how many games they played in that season, someone like Gary Neville, he'd started to establish himself. He made 16 starts that season. Nicky Butt had made 11 starts, but a lot of substitute appearances. So they were finding their way into the side. Paul Scholes was similar. He was used as a little bit of a super sub, I suppose, when he'd come on later into games in that season. So from there, you could see, right, they've had a taste of the action. Now let's move on. So I think, again, going right back to the start of what I was talking about, 96 being that boom in modern football, when Manchester United win the Premier League title in 96 with their you can't win anything with kids sort of proper players, again, that's when you start to see that shift in what Manchester United are trying to do on the pitch.
Looking at the national team with Terry Venables now in charge, there's obviously excitement with the Euro 1996 finals coming up. What was the outlook now with Venables in charge?
I think everybody just wanted that tournament to arrive because Venables basically had 2 years of friendlies to try and come up with a cohesive plan for the team as well as entertain fans. Obviously, there was the violence that broke out against the Republic of Ireland at Lansdowne Road, which again sours a lot of the things that have happened with English football from the previous sort of 15 years, 20 years maybe before this season. But for someone like Venables, I think the players really enjoyed his training. Often you'll hear about Venables and Hoddle being talked about as, two great coaches. They like to be on the training pitch with players. I think, to be brutally honest, people were just glad that it wasn't Graham Taylor anymore. And I think Venables just was that fresh start they probably needed as a team. Shearer was on fire at this point. Obviously, the idea was who is going to be his partner. That was kind of a lot of the narrative around the England team. And Sheringham, although he was a good goal scorer, probably wasn't sort of the second best English striker, if we're being honest, but actually was probably the perfect partner for Shearer. So I think when Venables made that sort of decision and they could use those two together, I think moving forward, that made it a little bit easier for him as a manager to kind of then build the rest of his team. But he's got a lot of these Manchester United youngsters coming through. People like Redknapp, Paul Ince was a great player, McManaman. it seemed like he'd landed on a good set of players, a good squad of players that he could mould to try and get ready for Euro 96. Because really, the friendlies weren't really teaching him that much, but it was just something he had to go through to try and get his team selection right.
And the season ended with the Umbro Cup, which did not go well for England, but that's a whole other discussion. Also, during this season, we have the infamous Andy Cole and Teddy Sheringham substitution and the whole controversy around that. But I believe that only came to public many years later, right? I don't think at the time that was public knowledge, right?
I think a lot of people knew that they didn't speak, but I don't think a lot of people know when it was from. So I think they sort of knew that Cole and Sheringham were not really good friends at all. But I think Cole maybe revealed that only recently, I think.
Looking at the end of the season, what was the state of English league and football after this very dramatic season?
I think it was waiting to see what will happen next with England's two biggest clubs out at this point, Blackburn and Manchester United. If we're talking about league position and where they were going next, I think Blackburn going to the UEFA Champions League was huge for them. So people were looking to see what they were going to do. Manchester United obviously were planning an overhaul of their squad. And then it was interesting to see what was going to start happening with other clubs. So Ruud Gullit signs for Chelsea on a free transfer not that long after this. And again, he's the Klinsmann of the 1995 summer, shall we say, where sort of a London team, being that, cosmopolitan city that everybody knows, starts to attract players to it. So it's starting to move in another direction again from 94. Middlesbrough, I'm going to mention my own team. We start spending money. And we signed Nick Barmby from Spurs for more than what Blackburn paid for Chris Sutton. And we'd just been champions of the second tier. So again, as I was saying before, those teams that were getting promoted now were thinking we can actually maybe try and do something, stay in the league, get in the top half. So money starts being spent a little bit more liberally. Stan Collymore, obviously, as well, is this summer moving to Liverpool as well. So the money starts to being spent and moved around the league, certainly by these teams. Les Ferdinand goes to Newcastle to replace Andy Cole. So again, you've got all these players who are starting to move for bigger fees, and you really do see the shift into sort of the Premiership that we know from the back end of the 1990s.
At the end of this season, you have Trevor Francis fired at Sheffield Wednesday, Brian Horton fired at Manchester City, Alan Smith, not the striker, the Crystal Palace manager, is sacked as well. Jurgen Klinsmann decides to join Bayern Munich to have the chance to win a league title. He has one season in England. Well, he will return in the end of the decade for a brief stint. But in his very important season, he becomes a Football Writers Player of the Year, and he finishes second in the Ballon d'Or race at the end of the year, much of it because of his performances with Tottenham that season. You mentioned some of the transfers. Obviously, Dennis Bergkamp and David Platt will join Arsenal with new manager Bruce Rioch. David Ginola, the French winger, will join Newcastle, as well as Mark Hughes will join Chelsea. And I would also, I think, want to point out that culturally, this season is probably the last pre-David Beckham season. Because obviously we all remember him. He got into the limelight because of that goal in the first match of the 96-97 season from midway against Wimbledon. But it's really this following season, 95-96, where he really establishes himself in the Manchester United squad.
In closing, what do you see as the cultural legacy of this season that makes it one of the most significant seasons of the Premier League era?
I think it's the end of the beginning of the start of the Premiership, if that makes any sense. Because you've got this sort of early period where 92-93 is very much just an extension of the First Division season with a little bit more cheerleaders and sumo wrestlers and Richard Keys' jackets. 93-94 is where United start to exert that bit of dominance, and it maybe starts to look a little bit different in terms of the teams that are on the top end of the league. This one kind of packs in all the controversy of maybe like a full decade of football in one sort of 9-10 month season. And obviously some of the things that happen in this season with clubs realising that despite his actions, they probably need a Cantona. Chelsea do that with Ruud Gullit. lots of teams start thinking, Arsenal do it with Dennis Bergkamp. As I said, Middlesbrough do it with Juninho. All these clubs realise we need this sort of talismanic figure in our club to sort of move us to the next level. So I think from a transfer point of view, from a football point of view, the introduction of those players from other leagues really starts to shift the nature of what football was going to be like in the country. And again, once Wenger arrives in 96, further selling this promise of the boom in 96, it sort of comes out of a lot of this season in terms of wanting to succeed in Europe and being successful as a football club and bringing some of those other influences into the league. And then you've got the build-up. I mean, what I found actually, you asked culturally there as well, I think that link between football and music, I found quite difficult to touch on in the book because there was so much football to write about. But there's probably an alternative version of the book that focuses on a lot more of that side of it, and sort of the journey towards cool Britannia, if you like, as New Labour coming in a few years later. So there's all those other things that play really off the pitch in terms of, the Gallagher brothers wearing Man City shirts and what that meant for football fandom and that kind of thing. So all these things and it being a midpoint of the decade kind of come together to give it that lasting impact, in my opinion.
With that, we'd like to thank you for your participation in this interview. Our respective contact information and the links to Mr. Fletcher's books are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Rob, thank you very much. This was a very enjoyable discussion and brought back many memories. And I can't believe it was 30 years ago when this season kicked off. So, thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.